live event, the first of many, hopefully, scheduled with Professor Steve Keen. This is a continuation of the COVID and climate correlations channel. And we want to welcome everybody. You're noticing that there's going to be some participants in today's event, and that is for patrons and special guests that are invited on the live event. So we think that this new interactive approach is going to yield some interesting conversations, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have Steve leading the discussion. Thanks, Steve. How's it going today, Steve?
Oh, I've got to say a bad start. I'm a terrible sleeper, and I woke up at 1:30 this morning, and that was it. So if eyes are looking drowsy, that's the reason why. I got back to bed a couple of times, maybe got an extra 60 minutes sleep, so that's not so good. But I've already spoken to a newspaper about syndicating my ideas. They approached me, and I've got a YouTube approach from, what's it called, Brilliant, the website Brilliant. So it seems to be, maybe I'm getting some access these days. I'll have to wait and find out.
Right on, right on. So we had a loose intent or desire to jump into the Minsky software. And in particular, I was thinking about, let's see, where was it here? In the new economics, I think it was figure 2.5. Does that ring a bell, Steve?
Well, I need to get the book and take a look and find out. 2.5. Okay, hang on. In section, the fundamental monetary operations of the government. Yeah, I'm actually just explaining that of all things to the guy from the newspaper who's approached me to write a regular column. So I'm nice. all geared up and ready to go.
Okay, so just feel free to share your screen and we can jump right into it.
Okay.
I did explain to Liam and that don't feel that we can't throw questions, even tangential questions, into the mix. It's a small group here, so by all means, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
How long are we going to be together, just roughly, so I know when to become assertive?
One hour. 1 hour. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's what I got today was a bloke who wants me to write an economic column for a newspaper. I won't talk about it till it actually happens. Not a large amount of money, by the way, just as an interesting audience to be able to reach. But he sort of started regurgitating the reserves, banks lend out reserves argument to me. So what I did was, look, I can prove that why that's wrong in 10 minutes, which is what I did. So here's Minsky. Minsky's it's a system dynamics tool. So you can use all these elements up here to create mathematical models that give you, dynamic systems and so on. But there's plenty of programs that will do that. The only thing that Minsky has, which is totally unique, is this idea of what we call Godley tables after Wynne Godley. And what they let you do is model financial dynamics using both at the front end double entry bookkeeping. So I'll just show this in double entry bookkeeping mode. And at the back end, generate differential equations out of them, which shows what's actually going on. So this is looking at the banking sector. And I'll bring up its own individual table. We've got more flexible powers to control it here. And I want to start with saying, looking at a bank, we all know that banks have reserves. So we're going to have reserves as an asset for the banking sector. And banks make loans. Those loans as an asset of the banking sector. They take in deposits from the public. And then the bank itself has its own equity. And I'm going to ignore long-term equity and just look here at short-term equity. So this is the operational account of the banking sector. And let's say we start with let's say it's 100 billion, it could be 100 trillion, it doesn't matter, it's just a number to show an example. 100 billion, let's say, in reserves, say 500 billion in loans, let's say there's 550 billion in deposits, and therefore the bank has 50 billion in equity, and that's our starting point. Now, what most people think happens is they think that banks lend out reserves. So what I want to show is that whole idea, lend out reserve. I'll show what banks actually do. That's probably the best idea. Let's say a bank loan. What happens when a bank makes a loan? Well, it's simple. They put a deposit amount of money in. Sorry, I'll just start over here. They put an amount of money in a deposit account, and they say, let's say you want to build a house. They're saying, here's $1 million to build a house. So we're going to put $1 million in your deposit account, and to do that, we record you owe us a debt of $100 billion, of $1 billion. That's all there is to lending. It's so simple. I've forgotten who actually said it, but somebody said, if anybody knew how lending banks actually operate. It's so simple it would disgust the mind. But that's the basics of lending. Then once you've got a debt to a bank, you've got to pay interest on it. And you pay interest by taking money out of your deposit accounts. This is looking at the aggregate level, so I'm leaving out principal repayment here for the moment. And you pay it to the bank. That's the increase of the equity of the bank. And then you repay the loan. There's debt repayment over time. So there's some repayment going on. So you put a minus repay here, and that also means the bank then records that they reduce the amount you owe them. That's fundamentally what happens with real banking. Now, what people think happens is they think you have lending out reserves. I'm going to call this minus. I'll call it lend underscore R for reserves. Okay. Now, what's the next operation? How do I actually show to balance this? Because what Minsky is doing is double entry bookkeeping. It's making sure that every row sums to zero. Otherwise, you made an accounting error. So if you imagine you lend out reserves, you're going to imagine the first thing you might think is, well, I'll put that money in the deposit account. Only Minsky says, that's wrong, because the accounting is false. You can't reduce reserves, which are an asset, and increase deposits, which are a liability. That just doesn't happen. There's something wrong with your accounting. So what you've got to say, well, okay, this is what happens. So you then let reserves go down and loans go up. So you have a drop in one asset at the banking sector and an increase in the other. But the thing is, where's the loan turning up for the actual depositor? The depositor not getting any money out of this. So under what circumstances will the public agree to this form of lending? And you've got to then look at it from the public's point of view. So I'll bring in another godly table, and I'll call this the public for the non-bank public. And I'll also put it into the same mode, so you see the what happens on the big screen once I start putting the elements together. And now what Minsky has, which is it's the unique, the reason we use double entry bookkeeping so powerfully is I can bring up the public's godly table now and say, well, let's allocate what was a liability for the bank, which is the deposit accounts here. That's an asset for the public. So I choose that, and there's deposits. What's an asset for the banking sector is a liability for the public. So I choose that, and that's loans. And now Minsky is matching all these levels here. So I'm going to call this here public for public equity. And I can now show the public actually starts with 50 in equity because they've got deposits of 550 and loans of 500. So they've got 50 positive equity. Interest payments come out of their equity. Lending and repayment are already covered by the program. What do I do with Lend R? Now, the only way to handle it is say, well, maybe you get a loan in cash. And so what happens is, I've got it in the wrong spot. I put it on the wrong side. So I'll just actually fix that up. Minsky will warn me here. I'm turning an asset, a liability into an asset, but that's what I meant. The only way to have this work is that the lending, which increases your liability, we've got that part covered. What they do is the bank gives you cash. So you walk out of the bank with cash. Now, in that situation, we finally have lending from reserves. So the bank gets an asset they can charge interest on. It loses reserves to do it. The public gets cash in its hand, but that's the only way that so-called fractional reserve banking works. Now, when's the last time you went into a bank and walked out with a loan in cash? Okay. It doesn't happen. Banks lend by crediting your deposit account, and they credit the loan at the same time. So the whole textbook mechanism, which argues that banks create money through fractional reserve lending, take in deposits, lend out a fraction, that gets deposited in another bank, et cetera, et cetera. It only works if all loans are in cash or negotiable instruments and so on. And that is such a trivial part of lending that it's just you can ignore it. So the main situation is banks lend by crediting deposit accounts, and that's where your money comes from. So that's looking at it from the point of view of the public. But what about the government as well? So I've got to look at the central bank. I'll call this the Fed, because we all know the Fed. It is the Fed. Imagine I'm doing this for an American example. And now we look at the Fed, the godly table. And this is all made self-consistent by Minsky. So I'll bring up its little window here. And then what we know that we have reserves as an asset of the banking sector, or they're a liability of the Federal Reserve. And so, by the way, is cash. Okay? So I've now got that turning up there. The cash isn't actually physically held at the bank; it's come out to the public. But, okay. In fact, yeah, I think that's correct. I think I can get away with that. So I'll call this Fed over here for the equity. What assets does it have? I haven't included it here, but let's say the Fed, the Fed has bonds which are owned by, let's say they're worth 100. So now I've balanced the system. So how do we actually get government spending? So I'm going to be flashing all over the screen here, but let's see if I can handle it. Go back to the bank sector and have government spending. So what the government spending does, it actually gives money to the banks in terms of putting it in the reserves. So the asset that banks government spending is not loans, it's reserves. And then that money gets spent on the public. That's how government spending occurs. And taxation works in the opposite direction. So when I have taxation, what happens is you have minus tax coming out of the deposit accounts, and that also reduces the reserves. So that balances the whole thing. Now, if you come and take a look at it from the point of view of the public, what's going on there, trying to now balance their table to include what happens with government spending, you find that spending increases the equity of the public and taxation reduces it. So in other words, government spending makes the public richer. It's not borrowing money from the public, it's creating money that ends up in the public's bank accounts. So deficit spending is not a burden on the public, it's actually a way of financing the public. And this turns upside down the attitude you get from mainstream textbooks that the government has to borrow in order to spend. The final thing I'll cover, because I'm now going extremely quickly, let's just go back up to here with the Fed once more. I've got the spending and taxation hitting reserves. Where's it coming from? Well, the Treasury has an account at the central bank. And I'm going to give, let's just say I could leave 0 in there. In fact, operationally, that's what tends to happen. But I'll leave it at, say, it's 10, just so people don't hassle me about that particular detail. So spending reduces the amount of money in the account and taxation increases it. And if you have a continuous deficit, what this means is this will go into overdraft. Now, that's not allowed by the government systems. So what's the government law? The governments have passed laws that don't allow the Treasury to run a deficit, to run a negative balance at the central bank. So what they're required to do is sell bonds. So what we now have is revenue from bond sales to banks. That's going to increase it, and that actually therefore comes out of the reserve accounts of the private banks at the central bank. And if you now go back to the banking sector's view of things, what's actually going on? Well, they now have bonds, which are treasury bonds owned by banks. So the reserves go down, they get an increase in their bonds, and what they've done is they've now swapped an asset which, with reserves, you can't trade reserves, and you don't normally earn interest on reserves. Now, when the government says, here are bonds, the deficit that's been run by the government creates additional reserves, and if your bonds are equal, the issue of your bonds equal to the spending you're doing, the reserves that are needed to create to pay for the bonds are created by the deficit itself. So banks, of course, are going to accept an offer which says you want to swap non-tradable, non-income earning reserves for tradable income earning bonds. They say, yes, please, and therefore they transfer it. And finally, you'll find interest on bonds. Let's actually cover that. So we now have, this is now an interest payment on bonds, which is made to the banking sector. And that's now got to be explained. I'm going to jump over that because I know I'm spending too much time here and I've probably got people's heads spinning as well. But there's also banks selling bonds to the public, and that actually reduces the amount of money in circulation. So I'll quickly show that. If you sell bonds from the banks to the public, then that is paid for by the public out of their deposits. What they get out of course, is it's mainly there's going to be the non-bank financial sector buying off the banking sector. That's where most of the bond trading occurs, but that actually reduces the amount of money in circulation. So that was a hell for leather coverage of how money is created by both the banking sector and the government, and it's completely different to what neoclassicals teach.
Can I, Steve? Can you bring that up just one more time? I had a few questions here about some of the notations and how
Yeah,
the
sure.
session actually worked. Yeah,
Yep.
and oh, hold on a sec. I just have to. So this is more of I'll be exploring the Minsky software myself, and so this just actually has to do with just using the software. So
Yeah.
in terms of now there may be somewhat silly questions here, but the dash int, the repay, these are all labels, and you have the ability to label whatever you want, right? Is that the
Yeah,
case?
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. So like, I've just used these labels everywhere, but what I want to do is make a copy of them, copy the flow variables, and copy the stock variables, and then I can start making a dynamic model of the whole thing. So this is, for example, the easiest one to show, and I'll just bring this down here and zoom in on it. Interest payments are obviously interest on the interest rate times the loan. So if I say there's a rate of interest on loans, call that R underscore, I'll call it loans, make it a large word. So rate of interest on loans, then that's now a parameter. I can make it a variable as well, but it's easier just to say it's a fixed parameter. So say it's 5% with a maximum of 20% and a minimum of 2% with 1% steps involved in changing it. And I then just say, let's type a multiply key. And I now multiply, just drag out an arrow from loans and interest to a multiply key. And now I've got an equation saying interest payments will equal the rate of interest on loans times outstanding loans. And I've told Minsky to recalculate. I get the initial flow as $25 billion per year or whatever it is. But that's only the start of building a system of differential equations. So once you've done all the definitions, all these things here, which are undefined, become defined. And then the flow elements down here let you simulate a dynamic model. So that's the overall purpose of Minsky, to be able to simulate dynamic systems. But also, because it is just so easy to lay out financial dynamics, simply seeing what the actual flows are is enough to answer most people's questions about money creation. And the answer is everything you learn in the textbook is wrong.
Yeah. So at this point, again, you have, like, if you switch to the godly tables at that point, does it change anything in terms of those formulas?
No, the formulas are independent. So the godly table defines, like, what the godly tables are doing. Let's go back here and show one in more detail. Let's go and take a look here. So what I've got here is reserves, okay? And you've got an initial number, which is 100, and I've got minus lending out. Yeah, okay. All these terms become elements in a differential equation. So the rate of change of reserves is minus lending reserves, plus spending, minus tax, minus bonds to the banks, plus interest. And if you look in the equation tab, Minsky is generating that.
Share your screen again? Can you share your screen
again? Pardon me. I'm talking and thinking I'm sharing my screen. My mistake. Pardon me. Thank you. Okay, let's go back and share the screen. So if you take a look at this column here, this is looking at the banking sector's point of view, and this is reserves. So I've got 100, and that's the initial amount of money in the reserve account. I've got minus lend R, plus spend, minus tax, minus bond B. I've actually got to minimize this while I do this. Otherwise, we get the cascading screen effect. So what Minsky does is say, well, the rate of change of reserves is minus lend R, plus spend, minus tax, minus bond B, plus interest. And if you look on the equations tab, I can't magnify it, but that's the equation there. So Minsky is generating these sets of differential equations for you. And once you've done it using a godly table, you know that the equations are correct because...
Well, Steve froze there. Just give it a minute here. It looks like
Minsky.
Steve froze.
Sorry for that.
He'll be back.
Okay. So that was very high speed, but I hope it was okay. Was it reasonable or too fast?
Well, I've watched you a number of times do a similar analysis, and it was still pretty fast for me. But
okay.
It was still well done. I'm trying to understand what the dynamics of this system mean. Is this type of financial system compatible with a finite planet?
No.
Right now is the stability of this system tied to growth in both the monetary supply and the economy. We know we need to limit the material and energy
It doesn't.
throughput.
One mistake. Yeah. One mistake people make is to believe that the interest, because you pay interest on debt, therefore the system has to expand for that reason alone. That's simply wrong in accounting terms, because when you look at what interest payments are, that's a flow. If you have a debt of 100 and your rate of interest is 5%, dollars per year to service the $100 debt. And people think, well, that causes the loan itself to grow, and that's simply just a mathematical error. But the fundamental thing is, if you have a system based entirely on private profit, with no constraints on its behavior, then it's going to try to make a profit out of the entire planet. And that means it'll be exploiting any free resources it finds. And that's what's causing global warming. We're using energy which happens to have been, stored solar energy from a billion years ago, and we're burning it once. And because you get it for free, and that's the real issue about freedom, you get it for free. Nobody made the resources. You don't pay for them. You don't pay their actual cost. You pay the mining costs, which are not the costs at all of the actual resource. And that's that's the ultimate source of profit. And if you keep on doing it on the planet, you'll wipe the ecosystem out, which is what we're doing.
Yeah, so what type of monetary model is compatible with the planetary boundaries and kind of providing a good footing for the social well-being of people while not stripping the planet of its ecology?
We've lost a few words there, I'm afraid. It's bad internet at mine. Can you say that again?
Yeah, what type of monetary system is compatible with a... Oh, can people hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
What type of monetary system is compatible with a finite planet? Or,
I think fundamentally you need to appreciate, well, two things. You first of all, you need to enforce the boundaries independent of the economic system. Wilson was in favor of reserving half the planet for wild species. I think we have to make that decision and say the primary role of humanity is to sustain life on this planet, regard ourselves as custodians of life on the planet. And that means we have to reserve, and Wilson's recommendation was half the...
A little frustrating here, so he's has a low signal again. Steve, you might jump out, pop in again, I guess. I'm not sure, but it looks like the signal dropped down. And then this one came from A-Box, a question and it's why does interest not cause infinite growth? Could you elaborate? Is it because of the role of taxes in MMT? So let's see what's going on with Steve. Huh. He'll be back. Well, Greg, you got the spotlight there.
I don't know why I'm not talking.
I know. Did you? How are you finding the presentation so far?
I've likewise watched it a number of times, and I get what he's saying. So it's great. I would like to ask the same questions as to what are the alternatives and what practical means there are of generating change at this sort of level. But it's a big ask.
Yeah. How about you, Liam? Where's your head at right now?
Yeah, I think these talks always make me realize downloading the Minsky app and working through this particular arrangement is the only way to solidify.
For a while there, were you still chalking away?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know where the internet failed in my home by the looks of it, so I lost connection.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's. I think Liam, you were saying something. So you take it back and just tell me, where your head's at, and Steve will listen. And we got a question up next too about interest, okay, and infinite growth. So let's hear from Liam, and then we'll go on to the question from ABOX.
Yeah, I was just saying that I've seen this analysis a number of times, and I buy in that our current private debt-based monetary system isn't financially sound for the well-being of people or planet. And I'm interested in the practical alternatives and also the types of power analysis of the landscape of the banking sector and the international politics. Where are these inflection points that, whether it's public opinion or particular political agents could actually make a change, because otherwise
Yeah.
it really feels like we're quite entrenched.
Yeah, I mean, I think you simply can't have unconstrained capitalism on a constrained planet. That's the bottom line. And because capitalism is a very intrusive system, if you've got a chance for personal profit, you will take it. And that means we've gone into apparently like 97% of the planet now has been affected by humans. You only find 3% that can be recorded as unaffected. And that's because you can find profit there. Because ultimately, and this comes back to the analysis I do not on money but energy, what GDP fundamentally is free energy turned into useful work and useful products. And because this is where the physicocrats were the only ones to get it right, because of that so-called free gift of nature, if you can profit from that free gift of nature, you will go and do it. And that's what led to the ecological overshoot we're caught up in now. So the only way is to recognize that capitalism has to be constrained. And I like E.O. Wilson's concept. Even I'd go even further. He wanted to reserve half the planet, which would mean we're going from taking 97% of it to 50% of it. Reserve half the planet for wildlife. In other words, we'd have no-go zones. You just see there are parts of the planet spread across all continents where humans simply out. If they go there, we could use drone technology these days to control their behaviour. But the idea is no, you can't go there. That has to be kept for life outside the human economy. And if we don't do that, then I think we're going to be destroyed. So that's Dan just put up the halfearthproject.org. And I think that has to be the overall constraint within which capitalism operates. Then when you look at how capitalism operates itself, one of the reasons that we have a runaway system, and this is the point that Frederick Soddy made, everything degrades in the economy except money. So I still haven't thought this through fully, because in some ways having a degrading money would actually encourage economic activity. In a crazy sort of way, even though I'm anti-Bitcoin, the fact that the money appreciates stops people wanting to spend it. And you actually get a decline in spending because they're hodls, hold on for dear life. So you need something which constrains your spending to the biological capacity of your planet. And that is a necessity until such time, and this is going to sound space cadet stuff, but I think it's ultimately the only way humanity is going to survive, is taking production off planet. Once we do that, continue doing that. That's impossible. Even if we imagine taking over all the energy in the galaxy, we would only last about 2,000 years before we were using all the planet energy, and then we have to go to Andromeda. This simply can't be done. So you have to accept limits, and that's the failing of neoclassical economics, completely ignoring the existence of, and in fact the need for, limits.
Well said. Well said. Greg, did you have any questions at all? I think you were going to say
no,
something.
but I'm pretty much in agreement. And I follow your practical mechanisms of policy change that may be able to get us there. Things like changing classes of shares, um, things like the way that loans for housing is dished out, as far as based on return as opposed to your ability to repay. What the asset could possibly return. I'm just wondering what else you've come up with since you've taken much more of a entropy approach to your economics, whether there's more policy changes that you have seen, or whether or not the policy changes you were advocating before are also
good question. Yeah,
still
I mean
relevant.
the main contribution there is something that I thought up, and then I found somebody else had beat me to it. A guy called Adam Hardy has established a website called carbonrationing.org. I think it's actually renamed it to carbonwatchdog.org. But he proposed, and I proposed independently, we're now working together, the idea of universal carbon credits. With the idea we'd have a parallel monetary system. So every good would have its money price as it does now, but also content price, which would be just how much carbon was being generated by that product. And you have to pay both prices when you bought anything. And universal carbon credits would be distributed through a central bank, through central bank digital currencies on a per capita basis. And you could do it on a daily basis as well. Just you wouldn't need to do it once a year or once a month. You could even faster. So you would initially say, I think interesting from Christopher Dobby is inflation, the thermodynamics of money. I think it's yes, pretty much the answer there. But back to the idea of universal carbon credits, you would get allocation, which could be based initially on the average for the country. So everybody in the country would get the average carbon consumption ration per day. Now, because the distribution of income is so massively skewed, 95% of the population would not use the average, they'd have leftovers. And the poorer you were, the more leftover you would have. Whereas the wealthy, certainly 5%, possibly just even 1%, would consume so rapidly they'd run out of UCCs. They had plenty of money, but no universal carbon credits. So they would need to buy universal carbon credits off the poor. On a daily basis, they're able to buy anything, including avgas for their private jets and so on. So the
little bit of a lag on there. Well, we've been doing okay with a few little blips here. So let's see if we can fix that. I'll be right back.
How you doing, Steve? You well?
Reza, he's on freeze right now. We've had a few issues with his internet, so.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I just thought it was. I thought it was me. That's all.
No, you got the stage now here.
Oh wow.
Yeah, the stream is frozen. So yeah, just wait for Steve to come back in. Well, thank you for joining us, Reza.
No, it's a pleasure. I just got an email that I was finding it hard to get sleep here in London. And yeah, it said, come along. There's only 6 people. There's a prize to be won. And I was like, what is it?
A prize?
It's a live stream with Steve Keen. I said, great, fantastic.
Well, I don't know about the prize, but that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty good. I've really enjoyed what's the word? What's the verb? Patronizing, not Patreonizing.
Patreon, yeah.
Steve, because I was going to bring up his kind of hissy fit with The Guardian, but I actually quite enjoyed it,
Oh, recently,
because, why
sorry about that.
Hi, Steve. How you doing? You well?
Hi. Good to see you, Reza. Yep.
Yeah, I was just saying I really enjoyed your unsubscription from The Guardian. I mean, it really is, and actually the public way you did it. I know it didn't, maybe not, it wasn't to everyone's taste, but really some of these outputs give us so little. I've really enjoyed being a Patreon supporter of yours over the years, and actually just the model that you've taken over. I really think I don't agree with all of your economics, but I love the fact that you put everything out there, especially on private debt and issues like that, and then you kind of correct yourself in public, which is quite is really educational for followers of yourself. When you feel you've got wrong, you're very, you don't have the ego not to correct yourself or whatever. But I really am excited to see what Minsky brings about. And
Thank you.
I know you also have shifted a lot towards climate issues recently. Just the point you made about carbon credits, they've been such a catastrophic failure in the past in terms of, anecdotally and in terms of how could you possibly think or guess that it might work in the future? But I mean, the sound of a central bank issuing, I mean, this is an existential problem, and the notion that some big bureaucracy would be able to manage issuing these carbon credits in a non-corruptible fashion, it's a difficult one that I find that
I look back at the Second World War.
yeah.
When you face an existential threat, that both changes the nature of government, actually changes who runs it too. Remember, one of the main people involved in the rationing process in the Second World War was John Kenneth Galbraith. You couldn't get a better critic of capitalism than JK. So in that circumstance, Chamberlain gets chucked out of office. You get, not that he's the world's perfect person, obviously, but you get Winston Churchill instead. So when you realize you are facing an existential threat, then you get rid of the idiots like, for example, they're just choosing somebody at random, Scott Morrison in Australia, totally useless turd. You chuck him out because you know he can't cope. You don't want him. The last thing you want is Scott Morrison running the war effort, because he'd be handing over the country to the Japanese on day 2. So that sort of person gets kicked out, and you get decent people in there. And then you can say your bureaucrats are dedicated to a common objective, which is survival. And so that's what I want to do. Is I want to set up central bank digital currencies before it becomes obvious we're having an environmental crisis. Now, by becoming obvious, I mean becoming obvious to everybody, not just to people who are activists in the area that it's going to happen, and these weather events probably are due to climate.
And do you agree with Professor Werner's take, the CBDCs?
No, I don't.
You don't think they will undo banks as they are? Because banks are pretty much in an oligopoly kind of way already. So I know he can be a bit weird sometimes, but he does have a point in the sense that a lot of some of the stuff I've learned from you is, and I have to say, much more than people like yourself and Petrol, much more than any economics degree I did. But a lot of that, a lot of the way that money works, would it undo some of the things that we're just beginning to? It's actually becoming more and more mainstream. More and more people, beginning to accept that households aren't like governments, and the credit card, things that are very easy for journalists to use as a false analogy, and people are beginning to call them out increasingly, and MMT is becoming more mainstream. And I was just wondering, what's your view as how that would affect the? Because Vern is very clear. He reckons they'll do away with all banks, and I've always wanted to sort of reply in my mind, but so what? There's only it's a difference between a monopoly and an oligopoly. It's not that big a difference. Yeah. But he's into all his Sparkasse and local banks and stuff.
A complicated position on Richard's views. So he's a great fan of the small banks in Germany, and says we need a small community scale banks that actually know the local businesses and can lend to people who are known to be good business people and entrepreneurs and so on. And I agree with that. I've seen examples of it myself in Germany, quite remarkable. But he sees the central bank has that they'll be, they're going to try to take over the whole financial system. I don't know how many central bankers Richard's met. I've met quite a few, and they couldn't organise a conspiracy to make a cup of tea. There's plenty of bright people in the research department. I'm not knocking the research department there. But most of the research department themselves still believe in neoclassical economics. The people at the top of the central bank haven't got an effing clue. So if they try to organise a conspiracy, I'd be quite happy about it, because I know the conspiracy would fail. There's a wonderful line in Don't Look Up where Jennifer Lawrence's character is hearing some of her young friends discussing about the comet and saying it's all been invented by the wealthy. And she said, the people you're talking about aren't smart enough to be as evil as you're giving them credit for. So that's my perspective on that thing. And also, most of the central banks that I have spoken to about this are aware of the dangers of undermining the private banking system by having a deposit account system for the public at the central bank. And that's why a lot of them have stopped looking at it. Like the Bank of England, for example, stopped looking at it. They've still got team, but it's sort of a back burner policy. So I would see what I'm seeing the central bank digital currency as is mainly a conduit to get government money to the public when it's needed in a hurry. So, for example, I wouldn't allow deposit accounts, for example. I wouldn't allow you to make a deposit at a central bank. As soon as you say you can't deposit at the central bank, then you can't be a rival for the private system. You can't borrow from them, obviously, either. So it's possible to set it up in such a way that it can't have the conspiratorial effects that Richard is worrying about. And as I said, knowing most of the bankers inside, they're afraid of the private banking system. Rather than like being these tyrannical people that are going to come in there and take over the private banks, most of them are scared of private banks and actually want to get a job in one and wouldn't want to do much to annoy them. So they're talking there of the mainstream economists.
But how is CBDC that? If you understand cryptocurrency, it's not really even that different from what we have now. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's not very. It's just saying that it's a central ledger. I mean, the whole house of cryptocurrencies is the massive decentralization is incredibly expensive in energy terms, so all that's nonsense. You don't need that. Cryptocurrencies solve a problem that didn't exist, okay? Which is you can't trust bank ledgers 99% of the time. You can. I know one or two instances where banks fraudulently hid their ledgers from old. This involves an Australian bank losing tapes at one point.
So a full reserve deposit at the central bank, they're afraid of those risks, but it seems like there's some pretty clear ways to make that less risky. Like you could have a limit on how much money could be put into that account.
Yeah.
And then you could slowly, reduce the federal insurance of private bank accounts in a way that doesn't cause a run on the banks. It just sounds like we don't have an ambitious vision and a capable public servant capacity to make these things happen yet.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, I think Richard drastically, again, I think Richard is one of the young people that Jennifer Lawrence was talking to. They're simply not bright enough to be as evil as you give them credit for. So I'm not worried about that. And in fact, they're being too cautious in many ways. I really see those banks as the central bank digital currency as a conduit for government interaction with the public sector, not for a way the government to take over the private banking system.
And you don't think Bitcoin has a role to play in terms of the restriction of the corruptibility of not just CBDCs, but the issuance of carbon credits? Because the history of carbon credits are so tainted, and there's so many landfills in Africa that have been just bought up, and middlemen trying to.
This has nothing to do with that. The UCC idea is simply every good has a price content. You're not trying to use it to do. You're talking of carbon offsets. Of course, they're corrupted. I'm talking of
carbon offsets, but I guess the name it was always called carbon credits, right?
Yeah, well, it's called universal carbon credits. So maybe we need a better name. But the idea is you get allocated these by the government on a per capita basis equal to the average for the country per day. Okay, there's nothing to do with carbon offsets.
Right. Okay. It'd be interesting to see. I can't wait to I'll let other people talk, but the Minsky, I can't wait to get started on that. I think it requires some time, but I really look forward to it and appreciate your work.
I've written a new book about it, which I'm publishing today, I think, or maybe later, on modeling in Minsky. It's both a book about my approach to economics and also how to use Minsky. We sort of mix together. So that'll be there for you. Hello, looks like the bell's being rung.
Okay, Steve.
Very good.
We're at the point in the conversation. Honestly, that was not me that rang that bell. But I want to do a little rapid fire of some questions. There's been some people in the YouTube stream here that have asked some pretty interesting questions. So try and keep them really short. We've got about 6 to 8 of them to run through. So let's start with fishing is fun. He says, Steve did a podcast about predictions for 2020 and 2021. Any predictions for 2022, Steve?
Oh God!
Do you want me to hold your beer?
Yeah, yeah. Basically, hold my beer. What I've now, I mean, people keep on thinking we're going to get back to normal, but normal was unsustainable anyway. That's the whole point of being on an unsustainable exponential trend. So my Christmas greeting now is it's not Happy New Year. It's brace for impact. So every year is going to be tougher than the previous one. We're seeing Omicron right now just causing an absolute explosion in cases. There's some hope that it will be part of the disease becoming endemic and less dangerous, but that's still, at the moment, that's wishful thinking. We won't know for 6 months whether that's feasible. My main worry is that I think what we're seeing in the climate could be the beginning of the breakdown of the Northern Hemisphere weather system. And I won't make a prediction that's going to happen, but I will say that most likely where that damage is going to occur is not going to be in the third world, which are all basically around the equator. It's going to be the advanced first world, which are basically in the temperate zone up towards the pole. And that's the area where the weather volatility is hitting. And if it really hits, then we're going to see the start of the breakdown of the Northern Hemisphere food production system. And I don't think it's going to happen this year, but it looks like it's the precursors to a breakdown in weather circulation systems are happening. And the more we put carbon into the atmosphere, the more severe that gets to be, which is why I want to be able to have a rapid reset using something like the universal carbon credits as a way of introducing a rationing system to reduce the load we're putting on the planet. That's not really a prediction. I think predicting in 2022 is a mug's game.
Hey, that's great. Okay, so next one. If a carbon disincentive incentive system is necessary, how to defeat risk aversion of the public, how to reorientate risky sounding concepts so they sound like ones that are normalized.
I think that comes down to actually recognizing the scale of the threat we face. And it's still seen, and the economists are responsible for this misframing of the problem. It's still seen by most people as an offset. Higher temperature, it's going to cost money to reduce the temperature. So there's a balance between increased temperature and the cost of fighting increased temperature. That's not true. It's an existential threat. And it's just in the same way we didn't say, well, what's the marginal cost of an extra German soldier on the English mainland? Where you had Churchill saying, we shall fight them on the beaches, etc., etc. We shall never withdraw. You have to realize there's an existential threat. And then once that is accepted, then you can do something that is serious about it. The trouble is that means you've got to wait till a serious crisis happens. And I simply think the best thing we can do is just politically accept humans are never going to respond to a crisis before it happens. They only respond after. So we need systems in place that when it happens, we can rapidly change the nature of the economy from one that is pumping carbon out without a thought into one that says we've got to drastically reduce our carbon footprint and reduce our energy consumption. But it has to be done in a way that is fair. And if you do it in a way that it puts the costs on the working class, you'll get another Gilets jaunes, and that'll be the end of it. And you'll get a breakdown in Mad Max. That way lies Mad Max. So I want to do stuff which enables us to hold on to an organized society when we start finding that we're undermining the productive capacity of that organized society.
Okay. Next one here. China. What are your thoughts? A sentence or two?
Again, China in some ways is more able to cope with this stuff than the West because two reasons. Even though it's got a huge footprint, it's smaller per capita to begin with. And it's because it has a central, people respect the central authority in China in a way they don't anywhere else in the world, really. So they put up with draconian measures, like the people inside the apartment blocks that had their doors welded shut didn't like it, but they were pretty much forced to accept it. So if you need to force a drastic reduction in carbon consumption and a drastic fall in per capita consumption levels, while making sure that's fairly distributed, so the rich end up having far more of a reduction in the consumption of the rich than the poor, and that's seen publicly, and they're shamed if they try to do otherwise. China's got more of a chance to get through it.
Right on. Okay. Next question is coming up here. Was jumping around a little bit. Okay. Talking about the possibility of central planning, Paul Cockshott. Are you familiar with Paul's work?
Yeah, Paul and I used to discuss on an old list called Marxism back in the early internet days in the 90s. And I respect his work and I like him as a person. But I think, again, what they're leaving out is the innovative side of capitalism. Central planning, yes, okay, you can do it with input-output analysis and so on. And we'll need to do that, frankly, in the transition stage, because you simply have to say we've got to reduce output, reduce our physical footprint, and find ways to do it. And central planning will be part of that, as it was during the Second World War. But in terms of when you look at the actual nature of capitalism, what you get is innovation and change in the input-output matrix, new products turning up and so on. And that side of things is something that's the positive role for entrepreneurship in capitalism, is in that level of innovation. And I don't want to lose that. I mean, as much as capitalism has been incredibly destructive of the environment, it's been incredibly creative in the physical and intellectual processes that humans undertake. And so I want to have that, but harness it, and it has to be subservient to overall social goals. And the main social goal has to be our role is to preserve life, because so far as we know, the Earth is the opposite, and we can't treat life being for the last 200 years.
Right. Okay. On to the next one here. World War II approaches across the Western powers highly instructive on how monetary system actually works, not to mention the power of government to control the economy and achieve the outcome. Not sure what's...
Well, that's very accurate statement. I mean, if you look back and see Beardsley Rummel in 1946 publishing "Taxes for Revenue are Obsolete," and that was one of the lessons of the Great Depression. Taxes didn't actually raise the revenue. What taxes did was reduce the spending power of the public. The government created the money that financed the Second World War, and they sold bonds to the public, not because they needed money from the public, but they wanted to take money out of the hand of the public so they couldn't spend as much on cosmetics, and more of it got spent on armaments. So World War II taught us a lot that neoclassical economists helped us forget very quickly, and we need to relearn those lessons. And I think my model of what we're going to do with climate change is fundamentally reproduce World War II, but now the battle is against our overreach on the planet, not against Nazis.
Right on. Okay. What do you think about the future of carbon capture as a new technology, as the new technology is evolving fast? We started on this a little bit now, a little bit more about carbon capture. Is it?
Yeah,
is
I mean,
the
carbon, I just don't think it's viable. I mean, the trouble is we do have incredible energy constraints. When you look at how much energy we get out of carbon-based systems, to replace that with renewable is probably an impossible task. Not just impossible in terms of how fast we need to do it, but impossible in terms of the resources needed. So the work of Simon Meachow, which is an Australian mining engineer now working in Finland for the Geological Survey of Finland, he's calculated, given the actual energy use, not just ignoring the fact that half the transportation on the planet is to transport fossil fuels from one point to another. He's taken that into account, and he still reckons you need hundreds of thousands of 1 gigawatt power stations with renewable energy to replace what we currently use in fossil fuels, and it simply can't be done. So we have to reduce our footprint. And carbon capture, I think, it's from what I've seen, the energy costs of carbon capture are nowhere near the benefits in terms of reduced carbon footprint. Carbon capture, we'd be better off finding ways to replace it. But it may be part of the mix because we've got to throw everything at this, and that includes nuclear, which, I mean, when I look at the calculations in terms of the amount of energy we need, can we get it out of renewables? The answer seems to be no. So every last non-carbon form of energy has to be considered.
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more of these. I was going to step over this one because we had already looked at this of smaller banks versus bigger national ones. What would Mark's want? I thought that was interesting. Speculating as to what if he was around today, what his perspective would be. You think?
Well, Mark's had a pretty good understanding of the banking sector. You look in, I think it's in volume 3 of Capital. A wonderful thing. Talk about centralisation. He said the money lenders and the parasites that surround them get the power to overtake the physical economy, and this lot know nothing about physical production and should have nothing to do with it. He was very much in favour of small financial firms being beholden to the industrial sector. So Marx would want much what Richard Werner talks about: small community banks providing capital locally, and not the large national centralised systems. And I feel the same way. I think we need non-profit. Go back to building societies for homes, credit and cooperatives. That sort of thing doesn't create money, but it circulates money that's already been created. So I'd like to see a nest of those hanging off government money creation as part of the way of getting money to communities and small-scale entrepreneurs.
Okay, I'm going to invite everybody back here again, and let's all, thanks Steve for coming by, and everybody's welcome to come back again. Please tune in. This was hopefully a successful first launch of our live stream. We're going to have another one next week, and I hope everybody that's tuning in on the streams, various different YouTube channels, as well as all of you guys today. I hope you had a good time, and thanks again, Steve, for joining us.
Thanks, it was good fun. I'll try to
guys.
get more reliable internet next time. Okay,
Right on.
bye.
Bye now.
Bye all.